Earthquakes are not a story about broken buildings. They are a story about a planet fooling the instruments built to measure it. A river runs backward under a flatboat. A shoreline rises 38 feet from the sea. Somewhere near the middle, pine trees whip toward the ground while the numbers scientists trust stop telling the full story. The river that ran backward. British botanist John Bradbury is asleep on a flatboat tied against a small island in the Mississippi River when a sound like steam roaring out of a boiler rips him awake. It is just after 2 in the morning, December 16, 1811, and the riverbank itself is sliding into the water. Trees crack and fall around him, panicked birds scream out of the dark, and for a few unbelievable minutes, the current of the Mississippi runs backward. This is the New Madrid seismic zone, far from the moving edges of Earth's crust where most giant earthquakes are expected. One leading explanation points to a rift, an ancient zone where the continent almost split apart 600 million years ago, whose buried faults can still move under modern stress. Stand on that riverbank that winter, and you would watch the ground crack open, spitting out warm water, white sand, and hardened lumps of oil the size of golf balls. Roughly 2,000 aftershocks followed in the first 3 months, and the main shocks were felt across much of the eastern United States. The unsettling part came later. Scientists found an active fault system buried inside a continent. The church that asked why. Inside a packed Lisbon church, candles are still burning for All Saints' Day when the floor lurches under the pews and dust swallows the light. Elsewhere in the city, 26-year-old English resident Thomas Chase is on the top floor of a building when it collapses beneath him. Badly injured, he eventually crawls from the wreckage. Walk those streets that 1st of November, 1755, and fire follows the collapse. Later, a tsunami surges up the Tagus, reaching about 40 feet at its highest run-up, roughly the height of a 4-story building. Lisbon's death toll remains uncertain, but estimates run into the tens of thousands. What happened next mattered more than the ruins. The Marquis de Pombal sent every parish in Portugal a questionnaire, 13 questions asking exactly when the shaking started, how long it lasted, which direction walls fell, and how far the sea pulled back before it returned. Grief, for the first time, was being turned into data. Voltaire read the reports and used them to attack the popular idea that this was the best of all possible worlds, a catastrophe that could somehow still be for the good. A young philosopher named Immanuel Kant went further, writing 3 essays that tried to explain the earthquake through shifting gases underground, a purely physical account, 2 centuries before anyone understood plate tectonics. The ruins left Lisbon with a new habit, asking why. The city that slept underground. 10,000 coal miners are half a mile beneath Tangshan when the lights go out. It is 3:42 in the morning, July 28, 1976, and on the surface, entire apartment blocks are folding to the ground in the dark. 17 months earlier, Haichang had been widely hailed as a prediction success after a conspicuous foreshock sequence helped trigger an evacuation. Tangshan offered no comparable usable warning. Half a mile below Tangshan that night, almost 9 football fields straight down, the shaking would have felt far less violent around you than it did on the surface above. Of the 10,000 miners caught underground, only a few died. Later engineering surveys found seismic damage in the mines far less severe than at the surface. China's government eventually confirmed roughly 240,000 deaths in Tangshan itself, though records and foreign estimates from those years put the true number well above 600,000. Haichang had raised hopes that prediction might work. Tangshan showed how unreliable that confidence could be, strengthening the case for buildings designed to survive quakes that arrive without a usable warning. The Selective Killer. 400 kilometers from Mexico City, off the Pacific coast, a fault breaks loose, and the shaking that reaches the capital should be too weak to matter. It is 17 minutes past 7 in the morning, September 19, 1985. Instead, buildings between 6 and 15 stories tall begin folding floor onto floor in clouds of gray dust, while single-story homes and skyscrapers nearby barely move. Engineer Emilio Rosenbluth traced the pattern to the ancient bed of Lake Texcoco beneath the city. Its soft clay amplified a roughly 2-second rhythm, about the back-and-forth pace of a grandfather clock's pendulum, dangerously close to the natural sway of many mid-rise buildings. Picture yourself standing on a street corner where a 15-story office tower comes down and the house next to it does not lose a window. Thousands died, and the final toll remains disputed. Mexico City's 1987 code demanded stronger resistance to sideways shaking and tighter limits on how far floors could sway. Distance was only part of the danger. The decisive clue was rhythm, and the buildings tuned closest to it took the worst of the shaking. The line the land drew. At 5:12 in the morning on April 18, 1906, San Francisco jolts awake. Cobblestone streets buckle into ridges, steel rails twist at right angles, and to the south, a column of red smoke rises over the first fires. Writer Jack London reaches the burning city later, after Collier's magazine asks him to report what happened, and he later writes that the city is simply gone. Nothing left of it but memory and a fringe of houses at its edge. Cross the farmland north of the city that week, and you would find wooden fences and country roads sheared apart and shifted sideways by up to 21 feet, as if the ground had been cut with enormous invisible scissors. Geologist Harry Fielding Reid studied survey markers taken before and after the quake, and found that the rock on either side of the San Andreas Fault had spent decades slowly bending under strain before snapping back into place. He developed that finding into elastic rebound theory in the Commission's 1910 report, a model in which stressed crust bends slowly and then snaps back during an earthquake. The rupture tore open for close to 300 miles, about the distance a car traveling 60 miles an hour would cover in 5 hours. The disaster handed geology a mechanism it had been missing, the quake that broke the ruler. The ground under Valdivia keeps moving. At 11 minutes past 3 in the afternoon on May 22, 1960, residents who run outside cannot stay on their feet as the earth rolls in every direction. Pine trees on the hillsides bend far enough to touch the ground, straighten, and bend again for nearly 10 unbroken minutes. You are anywhere near the Chilean coast that afternoon, and the shaking alone tells you this is different from anything on record. Older wave-based magnitude scales could flatten out on giant earthquakes, compressing the differences between enormous ruptures. Measuring Valdivia with those readings was like weighing a 40-ton truck on a bathroom scale built for 300 pounds. About a day and a half later, the volcanic chain of Cordon Colli erupts, a sign of just how deep and how wide the rupture beneath Chile had torn. In 1979, Thomas Hanks and Hiro Kanamori formalized moment magnitude, a scale tied to the fault area, the amount of slip, and the stiffness of the rock. Estimates for Valdivia's true size still range slightly, but it sits at roughly magnitude 9.5, the strongest earthquake ever recorded. For giant events like Valdivia, moment magnitude keeps tracking size far beyond the point where older wave-based scales flatten out. The Barnacle Line. Good Friday, 1964, and an ice-packed road outside Anchorage splits open under a line of parked cars. It is 22 minutes before 6 in the evening, and the shaking will not stop for 4.5 minutes, long enough that people describe the ground rolling like the deck of a ship in a storm. Spend that evening on Montague Island off the Alaskan coast, and you would watch the shoreline itself rise out of the sea, in places by as much as 38 feet, the height of a 3-story building. Geologist George Plafker read that uplift off an unlikely instrument, dead white barnacles, stranded high above the new waterline, marking exactly how far the land had jumped. In papers published through the mid-1960s, Plafker argued that a slab of ocean floor had dived beneath the continent, a process called subduction. His evidence became a major clue that Earth's crust is divided into moving plates, helping establish the framework that reshaped geology in the late 1960s and giving geologists a physical record of motion that surveys could measure directly. The buildings that learned to float. It is 5:46 in the morning, January 17, 1995, when the support columns of the Hanshin Expressway shatter at their base and hundreds of yards of elevated highway tip over onto their side, cars and all. Stand beneath that highway as it comes down, and you would see the concrete deck sliding sideways in a single unbroken slab longer than 5 football fields laid end to end. More than 5,000 people in and around Kobe died that morning, and the damage bill eventually passed $100 billion. Before Kobe, a small number of Japanese buildings had already been built on flexible rubber and steel supports, designed to let the structure float free of the shaking ground. But the technology was still treated as experimental. After Kobe, engineers adopted base isolation far more widely, though Japanese rules continued to allow several seismic design strategies rather than requiring isolation for every tall or critical building. Base-isolated projects multiplied after 1995, using bearings and dampers to reduce how much of the ground's motion reaches the structure above. Kobe turned a specialist technology into a mainstream engineering option in Japan, rather than a universal requirement. The fault nobody drew. The freeway bucks upward, as if struck from underneath by something enormous. It is 4:30 in the morning, January 17, 1994, in Los Angeles' San Fernando Valley. And unsecured furniture launches off bedroom floors into ceilings. Anywhere across the valley that morning, you would have felt an unusually sharp vertical jolt, a motion very different from the side-to-side shaking people usually picture. The rupture began about 12 miles down, nearly twice the cruising altitude of a passenger jet, on a previously unrecognized thrust fault, a buried break where one block of crust is shoved over another. Dozens of people died, and the damage bill climbed into the tens of billions of dollars. In the aftermath, the quake forced scientists to reassess earthquake risk from concealed faults across the entire Los Angeles basin, because the causative fault had escaped recognition before the earthquake struck. For decades, public attention centered on the famous, visible San Andreas Fault. Northridge showed that dangerous faults can sit beneath a city without leaving an obvious rupture at the surface. The planet on the monitors. In the days after Christmas, 2004, GPS records from stations around the Indian Ocean begin revealing sudden shifts in crust that normally moves only inches a year. The fault beneath the Indian Ocean has torn open along a line roughly 900 miles long, about the distance from Los Angeles to Portland, the longest rupture ever directly measured by modern instruments. Picture yourself at one of those monitoring stations, opening coordinates that normally drift by inches a year, and finding sudden offsets measured in feet after a single earthquake. Researcher Richard Gross at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory later calculated that the mass shift moved Earth's mean north pole by about 1 inch and shortened the day by roughly 2.7 microseconds, a change too small to feel, but large enough to calculate. For decades, geodesy, the science of measuring the Earth's shape, had been considered a slow discipline, tracking continents drifting over years. This earthquake expanded satellite geodesy from tracking slow continental drift to measuring sudden crustal jumps from a single event. The planet had changed measurably before the instruments had finished telling the story. If any one of these 10 changed how you think about the ground under your feet, subscribe for the next one.